Welcome back, travelers, to the Planeswalker's Tome, your portal to the realms of Magic the Gathering. Whether you're joining us on YouTube or through our podcast, we're thrilled to have you along for the journey. Now, let's resume our exploration of The Shattered Alliance by Jeff Grubb. Chapter 2, Lim-Dûl's Children. Ideally, history is supposed to be a smooth progression of one event after another, one building upon the next like a great stone block. Everything erecting the towering edifice that is the present. It's as if there were some grand, masterful god or planeswalker, or wizard whose grand design is being realized through every advance. Real history is rarely that neat. The world lurches forward in a spasm of war and expansion, followed by a period of stagnation and rot. Often the entire process slides backwards into riot and darkness. Often the world itself changes, freezing to a solid block, then in the blink of the eye, transforming into a warm swamp. The last change describes a period at the end of the Ice Age, when the Planeswalker Freyalise cast her world spell that broke the icy grip on Dominaria and the continent of Terisiare. Entire snow ranges metamorphosed into warm, thick disks that blotted out the sky and smothered the land for months. Glaciers cascaded into the sea, flooding the coastal territories. The very continent of Terisiare, held together by ice itself, began to break up into huge scattered islands that we know today. The age that followed the Ice Age had various names. The Age of Storms, the Age of Plagues, the Age of Floods, and the Age of Flowers. I prefer to think of it as merely the starting of history and beginning of the modern world. Arkle, Argivian scholar. It took them 2 weeks of hard flying to reach their goal. Most of the trip over the western part of the continent was conducted in storms that varied from merely irritating all the way up to thunderously perilous. More than once they had to seek shelter on the ground in the face of a thunderhead spreading across the horizon, higher than Yaya's 8th year could fly. Joda was surprised to discover that Yaya had arrived at Latnam on the back of a giant raptor, and even more so that Yaya could control the great beast effortlessly. 20 years previously, she had been vociferous in her dislike of riding the great Kajaldorian hawks. The world changes, he noted primly when he asked her about her first flight that night. I think I am allowed to change as well. Magic is change, after all. They were seated around a magically kindled fire. The one warm thing on a weedy, overgrown hilltop, surrounded by thick brush. The brush itself was crowned with top-heavy, night-blooming flowers, and their sharp scent wafted over the travelers. The sky was clear, a rarity in these wet, rainy times. Joda picked up on Yaya's thoughts. Mountains becoming islands, forests becoming swamps, plains rise again to become mountains, he said, finishing Joda's litany. You remember when such ideas were new, don't you? Joda thought about it and nodded. When mages were still figuring out which types of land produce which breeds of mana, for which types of spells. When spells were worked for the first time. When the first beasts were summoned. Inwardly he thought, I must sound like some kind of ancient mammoth talking like that. And now it must seem like old hat, said Yaya. Her offhand words struck Joda deep inside, as if Yaya were aware of his thoughts. He tried not to show it. There is always something new under the sun, Yaya. There is always surprises. Yaya nodded in the firelight. I think you said that just to provide cover for when you are surprised. And it does happen, and I do get surprised. So I rest my case, said Joda, rising slightly to push another damp log into the fire. When he sat down, he was close to her. But now, what have you been up to? It's been years since I've heard from you. Not even a note. Yaya didn't answer at first, instead staring into the flames. At length she said, I've been doing pretty much what you've been doing, what everybody's been doing, trying to figure out how to survive in this world of storms, trying to get by in the face of rain, plagues, and refugees, trying to help others do the same. There was something deep and somber in Yaya's words, and she did not look up when she said them. Some of the fire, the spirit, and the veritable cheekiness that was Yaya Ballard. Task Mage was subdued. Despite himself, Joda reached out to touch her shoulder to comfort her, and was surprised when she shrank away from that touch. What? Started Joda. Yaya held up her head and shook her head. I'm sorry. It's not as if I don't want your help. I mean, she looked up at the rippling surface of the glimmer moon, and not at him. I mean, that when I knew I found the hand, I knew that I would have to come to you. But I need you to know that I'm different. I'm not like you remember me all those years ago. Joda nodded sadly in the firelight. Yaya started to speak again, and Joda just said, I know. You know, she said, looking sternly at him. How can you? I know what you're talking about, Joda said. Magic is change. It happens to the land, and it happens to people. I just want you to know that you can still count me as a friend, and I hope you'll still think of me the same. The frisky fire appeared again in Yaya's eyes. She smiled. Hey, what are friends for if not to drag each other across the continent? Indeed, said Joda, returning the smile with a warmth he truly did not feel inside. What are friends for? Later that night, Yaya's words still echoed in Joda's mind. The task mage was sprawled out atop her bedroll. Bite the cold night. Face up. her arms sprayed outwards. Joda sat next to the flames, using an occasional bit of mana to keep the flames going, or maintain the active wards that kept the insects and bats at bay. The great Aether curled up on the far side of the fire, its head tucked beneath a wing. He had said that there was always new things, but he had lied. Joda had had this particular conversation, or this type of conversation before. His memory eternal, but tamed by the magic of the mirror, recalled so many times when someone who was once close seemed to grow suddenly distant to him. They had grown away, or grown suddenly colder, or just grown uneasy around him. What had truly happened was they had grown older, while Joda had aged almost imperceptibly in the same time. 20 years ago, 20 years of floods, and famine, and storms. It had been half of Yaya's life, but hardly a single percentage of Joda's. She had gone out and lived in that 20 years, and she had changed as surely as the islands eventually became swamps, and the plains became forests. She was still the same Yaya deep inside, but now she had a life's worth of experience on top of that. It had happened before, but each time the cut tore deeper, reverberating against similar emotions from similar times, bringing up memories of the times his friends had learned to live their own lives and leave him behind, one way or another. Joda looked at Yaya's sleeping form, calm and peaceful, the light from the flames casting dancing shadows across her face and arms. Things had happened to her, Joda thought, good things, and things less good. She had likely succeeded at some attempts and failed at others. Perhaps there was a loved one she would get around to telling him about. He looked at Yaya's hands, but there were neither rings nor pale bands of flesh that indicated rings were once there. Joda remonstrated himself. The lack of a wedding band proved nothing. Indeed, in the time they had been apart, she could have been raising a child, though the thought of Yaya Ballad as a mother brought a brief smile to his firelit face. Eventually, she would feel comfortable enough to tell him everything that had happened. In the meantime, it was his turn to change, to understand, and to treat her based not upon what she was before, but what she had grown into. He owed it to her as a friend, he thought. There was a distant howl across the brush, and a fury of bat wings took wing from their nighttime feedings. The Aether rocked slightly, and Yaya twisted in her sleep. A dark mask of concern and irritation flickering briefly across her features. Joda smiled and checked the fire and the wards one last time, then sprawled out on his own bedroll. He closed his eyes when a more distant howl answered the first. He was asleep by the time the creature finished its call. Originally, Yaya had wanted to head out to the small bazaar outside Soldev, where she had first found the hand, but Joda thought it sounded like a dead end. She had found Lim-Dûl's hand in one of the many refugee bazaars that now surrounded all the major cities, and the previous owner claimed to have gotten it from a cousin, who had picked it up from some other dubious source. Yaya argued for the first 2 days that it'd be easier to track the hand back to the battlefield, but at last relented. Only then did she ask Joda where he thought they should go. Joda explained his own thinking one evening in the first week of travel, when they were camped on an eroded tor that jutted out of a verdant grassland. Around their perch, the setting sun picked out of the wreckage of great white towers, now stained with age and overrun with vines, erupting from the grass with splayed teeth. It had been raining for days now, and the dampness threatened to overwhelm even their magically crafted campfire. Assume Mayor Syl is still alive, said Joda, pulling the travel kettle from the fire, and that he has merged with another individual, like he had with Lim-Dûl. The first place he would do is go back to his own haunts. The Keep of Trestlehorn? Said Yaya flatly, still obviously miffed by Joda's presumption about their destination. Joda nodded. Trestlehorn. It's always been a nexus of power. Even before Lord Ith formed his mage's covenant there. Before Marisil had usurped it from Ith. As Marisil, it was the site of his council. As Lim-Dûl, he made that area his home base to attack Kajaldor. If he's back, then he would head back there. Do you really think he would go back there again? Joda shrugged. It's pretty likely Marisil, both as himself and as Lim-Dûl, always struck me as pretty dependable. And I know him fairly well after all these years. And he knows you, said Yaya. We need to remember that as well, and he might plan accordingly. The weather lifted soon after, revealing a verdant landscape that had been covered with dead shrubs and snow for an eternity, but now had given way to great fields of grasses, rippling like a green ocean. They flew above herds of great grazing beasts that had come north, sweating, lumbering hordes of long-haired aurochs and mastodons. Dancing among them were goats and gazelles, which had already shed most of their snowbound coat and embraced the new land. There were people here as well, hunters mounted on a motley collection of pack beasts. Joda had Yaya bring the Aesir low over them, and was rewarded for his interest with a collection of hand-fashioned spears lofted into the air. Yaya brought up the reins and climbed over the hunters, cursing vehemently as she did so. Joda was not sure if all the curses were directed at the hunters. The land turned boggy now, and in the distance, Joda could see a great sea springing from the south, across the lowlands, glimmering like a mirror. He had read the reports and heard Yaya's own stories about the creeping sea spreading inland, but he could scarcely believe it. The ocean had appeared in the lifetime of a normal living man, but secrets were lost forever beneath those waves. The rapid change concerned him. Yaya had changed as well, he reflected. The young magellan who had come to his rescue 20 years earlier had grown into a very dependable, confident spellcaster, and had learned the better part of discretion. The younger Yaya would have charged the spear-throwing nomads, or at least chased off their herds in a fit of pique and a flurry of fireballs. This older Yaya showed the wisdom to just keep going, without Joda telling her otherwise. Part of him was proud of her maturity, but another part missed the impulse of youth. Such was the nature of age, he thought. It makes all of us responsible eventually. They paralleled the coast east and then north, slightly, then east again, making for Trestlehorn. They camped when they could find high and dry ground, otherwise pressing on in the darkness as long as the clear weather held. The Aether was uncomplaining, apparently used to such long travels. The third night after they reached the sea, Yaya asked, "Are we hunting Marisil or Lim-Dûl?" Joda blinked. "What do you mean?" Yaya frowned over her meal. Cold jerky and a bit of biscuit this particular evening. Marisil, who you knew, put his spears in the ring and possessed Lim-Dûl. So was the being we fought 20 years ago Marisil or Lim-Dûl? And when the wing was cast away, was it the spirit of Marisil or Lim-Dûl that was cast away with it? Jodak paused for a moment thinking, then he ventured, "I'd say both. I think the original Lim-Dûl, the warrior, was very much alive and a part of the Lim-Dûl we fought. But that Lim-Dûl was a combination of both Marisil's spirit in a ring and the original Lim-Dûl. The two were connected. When the ring was separated from Lim-Dûl, Marisil was still trapped within it, and with him, whatever he had learned as Lim-Dûl. The body that left was just the original Lim-Dûl. So if Marisil or Lim-Dûl then had picked up another form, said Yaya, would it act like Marisil or Lim-Dûl, or like the new body?" Joda fished out a piece of jerky lodged in his gums, and said, "You still don't think Marisil's at Trestlehorn?" "Maybe I do," she replied. "Or maybe I don't. I think that he is, because Marisil is both himself and the body he merged with. Marisil sort of imprints himself on his host, like a pattern on a piece of cloth. The original is still there. From everything I could learn, Lim-Dûl hated Kajador before he encountered Marisil. That hatred still drove him after they emerged. But still, he's a creature of habit. Marisil, or Lim-Dûl for that matter, will want to go home." Yaya said nothing in reply, but just chewed her jerky. Joda thought about it for a moment and added, "Let's call him Lim-Dûl. That's what he became after all. And that's what everyone else except me knows him as. Regardless, Lim-Dûl or Marisil, I think he'll want to go back to the place of his power, and that's Trestlehorn." The next day they turned north again, away from the spreading sea. Now they saw from the air temporary camps. Some of them no more than a ring of wagons and tents. Joda had them fly over one camp, and when there was no spears forthcoming, he asked Yaya to land. She shook her head, more out of irritation than refusal, but she set the huge hawk down not far from the encampment. She remained with the Aether while Joda talked to the refugees. He was back in less than an hour, the furrows on his forehead deeper than when he had left. "They were flooded out?" asked Yaya, as the great bird spread its wings and leapt skyward. Joda shook his head. "No. This group is fleeing south, and now is heading east since they encountered the spreading sea. They call it the Sea of Laments." Yaya ignored the geography lesson. "South? Then they know the condition of Trestlehorn." Joda nodded. "Yes. And they'd say that the castle is partially in ruins, that it's ruined by a figure known simply as the Lord. The Lord of Trestlehorn. You're thinking that's Lim-Dûl, or that he really did maybe return there." "Maybe I do," replied Joda. "Maybe I don't." There was silence. Then Yaya said, "Well, if that's the case, then I guess I'm wrong." "Don't throw in the towel too soon," said Joda. "The refugees also said that the ruined citadel was under constant siege by undead creatures. So, if the Lord of Trestlehorn is Lim-Dûl, the former Marisil, once the mighty necromancer, became Yaya. Just who is attacking him?" finished Joda, the furrows growing deeper by the moment. The air grew colder and the sky grayer as they flew northeast. As if part of this world had not yet got the news that the spell of ice had been broken. Yaya pulled out a heavier cloak from her pack and bundled it tightly around her as they passed on. The rain grew more sporadic, but it was heavier and mixed with bits of ice. Several times they were grounded by the frozen sleet and had to seek what shelter they could for the great mount. Finally they struck a new sea, this one spreading to the south, straining to reach the Sea of Laments. This ocean was white-capped with bits of ice and rime, piled up on its shores as it drove southwards. Joda realized that eventually the two oceans would join and rive the continent completely. They continued their flight across the eastern side of the bay. "What if the keep of Trestlehorn is flooded?" asked Yaya, during one of their enforced stops. Then I'll concede you are right, said Joda, but places like that never seem to go away entirely. Their power won't let them. If this bay gets larger as we go north, I'm willing to bet that the old keep is now an island. You know, I was thinking, said Yaya. Those refugees were talking about undead. Lim-Dûl wasn't the only powerful undead present. It could be one of the Planeswalker Leshrak's minions, left behind, or some of the traitorous Kajaldorians, the Knights of Stormgald, or something else entirely. Joda nodded and added, or Chaska, the keeper of Chesilhorn. He was Lim-Dûl's Castellan. You said you fought him at the Battle of Kajal. Yaya chirped, and one I might add. But Joda thought there was a word toned in her voice. The keep at Chesilhorn was not an island, but rather part of a large peninsula which jutted into the ice-clogged bay. The mountains that flanked it to the north and east were avalanche-strewn rubble, blasted in part by Freyalise's world spell, forming a great fan which spread out into the sea-born ice like a delta. Joda had Yaya circle. The great fall of the mountains had crushed part of the keep, but its central tower still stood, an uneven testament to the power of its original builders. The ground was covered with an uneven pattern of snow and mud. Set down on one of the big towers, shouted Yaya, over her shoulder to Joda. Hillside, Joda shouted back. We don't know who or what is inside. I'd rather try the quiet approach right now. Yaya said something Joda didn't catch, and brought the Aesir down on the northern side of the keep in an area of great boulders. Moraine, Joda remembered, a glacial moraine. The boulders had been plowed here by the force of glaciers, and now were mute tombstones to the passing of the huge ice sheet that had almost swallowed the land. There was no sign of any watchmen, or towers, or anything moving around the boulder field. The Aesir landed upon a boulder the size of a small hut, then hopped neatly to the ground. Joda slid from the bird's back. Yaya did the same, and then walked round to the front of it, stroking its beaks and reassuring it with low words. She pulled a small whistle from within her cloak and blew into it. It had an ear-tweaking tone in 2 sharp notes. The huge avian leaped upwards, and flapping its wings, headed for the mountains to the east. Joda looked at Yaya. She replied to his unasked question. It will come when I call it. Just because you want to be on the ground doesn't mean I want to risk its life as well. With that, she headed towards the keep. Joda followed. They quickly discovered that it was much better to deal with the snow than the mud. The former was old, crusted with ice, and carved by the wind, but solid footing at least. The latter was nothing more than a light brown slurry that clung to one's boots like a drowning man. After the first such patch of near bottomless muck, Joda, the now cursing Yaya, kept to the edges where the ice and snow still had sway. As it was, it took them an hour to get within clear sight of the walls. Shortly after that, they were attacked by the castle's besiegers. Their assailants were buried into the snowbanks, a favorite tactic of the undead of the Age of Ice. One moment, Yaya was complaining about how they could have at least landed close to the keep, and within the next breath, cadaverous shadows loomed out of the snow on all sides. These creatures were once human, but their dead flesh had frozen and congealed so many times that they looked like wax candle parodies of human warriors. Their blades were red and rough from rust. They clawed their way out of the snow, struggling to their feet, bearing down on the pair of humans that had entered their domain. Yaya's cursing intensified, but Joda was already concentrating, calming that center of himself with practiced ease, and pulling from that center its magical energies. He thought of the lands of Latnam, and effortlessly pulled the needed spell from his mind. He opened his hand palm downwards, and from each of his 4 fingers a blue flame sparked, then spiraled outwards, like dwarven fireworks. The blue bolt of mystic force arced and curved, homing in on a handful of ice-rimmed warriors. Each bolt struck a creature, and in striking turned its target into a spire of blue flame. Joda cast an eye at Yaya. She had summoned a flaming scythe and was cutting down the twisted undead around her like a farmer mowing wheat. She moved smoothly over the mud and snow, now she had returned the mangled corpses to their dead state. Joda paused to watch Yaya too long, and something heavily slammed into his side. He staggered a few paces to see his assailant, a dead knight in tattered armor, swinging the frozen leg of another former comrade downward at him. Joda dodged, and the leg struck the ground where he had been standing. The archmage muttered a few choice words, ancient words. He touched his assailant's chest, and the tattered knight's torso exploded in blue flame, sending his body parts in all directions. Joda heard a loud curse, and turned to see Yaya disappear beneath a wave of corpses. He reached into his mind for another spell, but Yaya reacted first. The entire pile of dead men suddenly caught fire and were flung backwards, tracing flame arcs through the air as each body fell. The ground shook beneath Joda's feet, and he dropped to one knee to steady himself. At the center of the explosion stood Yaya, her robes caked in mud, her hands before her, palms upward. Smoke curled from each hand. She had a very irritated expression on her face. Next time, she said, we land on the roof. Watch it. Joda did not have to ask, but dropped fully into a crouch. Yaya sent a flaming missile into the space that Joda had been previously. A wax-flushed warrior decked in a red mail plate exploded before it could bring its axe down on Joda's unprotected back. Joda turned and saw more dead warriors streaming towards them. These were different from the melted men and women Joda and Yaya were fighting. Instead, they were little more than bare bones, strung together in lacquered black, garbed in ornate, ancient armor. Silently, they advanced on Joda's position. Around them, the remaining twisted corpses were pulling themselves back to their feet for a renewed assault. As one of the skeletons passed the rising form of a melted corpse, the black lacquered creature lashed out with a long, curved sword. The blade hacked across the corpse's back, ripping the twisted flex open. The animated corpse collapsed, tried to rise, then collapsed again into the muddy snow. Move to one side, Joda said to Yaya. Get out from between the two groups. Another curse, but Joda saw that Yaya was doing as he asked. Both headed towards the left flank of the battle. The black lacquered skeleton smashed into the twisting corpses, and the two soon fell to battling each other, ignoring the two mages completely. Yaya staggered up, splattered with mud but otherwise unharmed. Next time, she began. The roof, Joda raised his hand in defeat. I think the corpses are the besiegers, and the skeletons are Sally, partly from the besieged. Let's see if we can find where they came from. Can you run? Do I have a legion of undead behind me? Came the answer. The skeletons tracked through the ice and snow, leading unerringly to a rough gap carved into the castle's wall. There were no more guards, living or otherwise, there at the moment. Joda and Yaya ran for the hole, and once inside, rested against the side of the wall, catching their breath. Joda took a deep breath and spoke. Those black lacquered skeletons. They were part of Lim-Dûl's home troops when he was last here. And the animated corpses, puffed Yaya, Kejadoran uniforms, storm-gulled knights, the officers of Kejeld who threw in with Lim-Dûl, made into the living dead by their new ally. They would have a reason to fight each other. Right, said Joda. So now we know who's fighting whom, but we don't know who's pulling their strings, added Yaya. That's the wrong question, came a third voice, ringing down the hallway. It was a rumbling bass voice, as bitter as old ice, and as deep as an open grave. The question is, what are you going to do about it once you find out? This concludes Chapter 2 of our saga. If you enjoyed the tale so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on both YouTube and your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, may your adventures be as boundless as the plains themselves. Thank you for listening.